Kumba opened as the tallest and fastest coaster in the southeast United States, and it was unlike really any other roller coaster that existed at the time. The ride is 143 feet tall with a first loop that goes around its lift hill. It was the sixth coaster ever produced by B&M, and it was the first sit-down coaster produced by B&M. The ride was absolutely groundbreaking when new, but these days it is Busch Gardens Tampa's oldest operating coaster since they have now removed Scorpion. The ride attracted a ton of media attention when new, with videos from the original opening day showing media standing on the lift hill and block brake as trains cycled through the ride layout. It was quite a different time. Originally, the ride opened with no seatbelts on the restraints, and so did a lot of other B&Ms around this time. These seatbelts were added sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s. They're affixed to the restraint itself just like any other B&M. The ride has been repainted several different times, and that includes both the trains and the structure. The trains have also seen different color foam added for both the seats and restraints over different years. It features one of the best color schemes of any ride, in my opinion, with the colors just seeming to pop, and that combining with the overall just appeal of how B&M coasters look. In my opinion, it is one of, if not the best looking coaster of all time. The roar the ride makes is legendary and honestly probably gave B&M their name for having rides that roar. It is different than really any other B&M, and it's louder than any other B&M in my experience and opinion. It is a defining feature of the ride, and it's part of what makes the ride so good, because the roar can not only be heard off-ride, but also on the ride. The logo has changed several times, most recently a few years ago to be a more simple, modern design. I personally prefer the old logo though. Kumba is rumored to have sinkholes underneath it or in the area around it that may affect its future operation. This is combined with the ride's age. The ride is very old, and a B&M at this age typically is near the end of its service life. The ride has visible rust in several areas and has had several sections of track and supports rewelded as well as replaced over the last few years. So it's definitely in need of a major overhaul, and hopefully it gets one. Hopefully it gets an overhaul much like Hulk at Islands of Adventure or Nemesis in the near future, because otherwise the ride may have to be removed, and it is already Busch Gardens' oldest attraction, so the ride may not have too long left. Kumba has 4 trains. It can run up to 3 at a time. The 4th train is rotated in and out to ensure that the ride can always operate with at least 3 trains, though it rarely does. When Kumba does run with 3 trains, the platform ambassadors are actually required to wear hearing protection due to the noise of all the trains cycling, affecting their hearing potentially severely. And that is one of many reasons the ride usually does not run 3 trains. Typically it just runs 1 or 2. The ride was updated with a new control system from Consign around the year 2020 that included seat sensors on the trains themselves, as well as presence sensors for the operators on the platform. This is a standard thing at many SeaWorld parks. It is, in my opinion, one of the best and most intense roller coasters in the world. It opened that way, and it's very different than a lot of other B&Ms. Even today, it is still probably the best coaster with inversions that I've been on. Let's get to the actual review itself. When you walk up to the ride, you have 2 different directions you can go from. You can go from over near Congo River Rapids, or you can go by Ubanga. Either way, you cross a bridge approaching the ride that gives you a fantastic view of the ride you're walking up to. If you're over by Congo River Rapids, you'll walk underneath the Cobra Roll for the ride, and if you're entering near Ubanga, you'll see the ride's zero-G roll and other inversions up in the distance in front of you. Once you get up to the ride, you'll hear the ride area soundtrack, which is usually played outside of the queue except during special events. This music is not original to the ride, but there is a playlist on YouTube with it where you can listen to it. As you approach the entrance to the queue, you'll cross a bridge that goes over part of the ride. You'll get a fantastic view to your left, honestly one of the best views of any roller coaster, of the ride's first drop as well as first inversion, as well as the 2 interlocking corkscrews. This is probably one of the most iconic angles of any ride ever, being featured in several different areas, in pop culture, as well as even in textbooks. It's one of the most iconic roller coaster images you've probably ever seen. As you continue to get closer to the queue, you'll hear the ride's roar. In fact, the ride's roar is amplified as you're near the ride because of the trenches that the ride travels through. These amplify the sound back to you and makes the ride both on the ride itself and around the ride area extremely loud. Particularly the tunnel, otherwise known as the Kumba's lair. As the train enters that area, the echoing of the train's roar coming back at you from the tunnel gives me goosebumps every single time. Once you enter the queue, you'll notice that it's very large, but it rarely has much of a wait. The queue line itself is mostly covered and features a lot of switchbacks. Once at the station, there's rarely a grouper, so you're free to pick any row of your choice. If you would like the front row, it does have its own dedicated queue, and is typically the only place you'll ever have to wait for Kumba if you visit on a slower day. If you pick the back row, which is my personal favorite, I recommend the unload side, as this will put you closer to the ground during the ride's vertical spiral. But all seats are very similar, and the front is great too, especially if you find this ride to be rough, like some people do. I personally do not. But some people do find it to be rough, and if you do think it's rough, try riding towards the front. It's typically a little bit better as you can brace for the elements a little bit more. The station fits in with the rest of the ride and really feels like an extension of the ride's queue with how it's themed to fit into the ride's area. The trains feature over-the-shoulder restraints that can lock in 8 different positions. This is a standard B&M design, but the ride does now have seat sensors that limit the number of these positions that can actually be used. The trains feature seats with a slightly higher verify for larger riders in some rows, which is also a standard for B&Ms in the US. The ride did not open with this, and it was added at some point in the recent past. After leaving the station, you will turn right and climb the lift hill. The lift hill is a classic B&M lift hill, which takes a good amount of time to get to the top. It's not as long as something like an Arrow, but it certainly gives you plenty of time to take in the ride and its surroundings. Part of what you should look at as going up Kumba's lift is the vertical loop that you're about to travel through. It looks absolutely menacing climbing the lift and going through it. You'll also get a great view of the park's boneyard, as well as the drainage pond for Congo River Rapids, which actually recently had a sinkhole open up in, which gives the rumors some level of truth. Also in the distance, you'll be able to see Busch Gardens Water Park Adventure Island. As you crest the top of the lift, you'll enter a pre-drop, which was standard on B&Ms at this time. This doesn't really give much in the way of forces. In the back, you'll get a little bit of a whip over it, but nothing really in the front. You'll enter into a curved first drop that builds up a ton of speed. The train will then speed down and enter the first vertical loop, roaring its entire way through it. At the bottom of the vertical loop, there is a trench that the ride dives partially into, which again amplifies the sound. In fact, to make this simpler, let's just say that for the rest of the ride makes an awesome noise. It's absolutely deafening. This is created by the hollow track the ride uses, the hard wheels the ride uses, combined with the worn track joints, which make a clicking noise when the train passes over some of them, as well as the usual B&M train clicking made from the anti-rollbacks when the train experiences negative Gs. This all combines to make one of the best sounding rides in the world. After you exit the first vertical loop, which has a great punch of positive Gs, you'll enter another trench between the first and second inversion that again amplifies sound. The second inversion is great and sets you up for the craziest part of the ride. The third inversion is a 0G roll, which was one of the first in the world. You'll experience weightlessness while being whipped quickly around 360 degrees. In my opinion, it's one of the fastest 0G rolls on any coaster anywhere. You'll then fly lower underground compared to the start of the ride and into a bank turn which throws you to the side as you prepare to enter the Cobra Roll. The Cobra Roll offers the best positive Gs on the ride. You fly through it with an insane amount of speed. The roll is also over the path that leads to Congo River Rapids and, by extension, Kumba. It is a fantastic visual both on and off ride, and you are flying through this element. I typically gray out during this part of the ride. It is unlike any other ride. The only thing I can really compare it to is parts of Intimidator 305, or whatever it's called these days. You'll then exit the Cobra Roll and enter a block break. The train has a ton of speed going into this block break, so God forbid it ever has to stop here, it will absolutely slam to a stop. Usually the train is trimmed slightly and dives into the interlocking corkscrews. This area of the ride features 2 interlocking corkscrews and, like I mentioned before, is extremely photogenic. It also features trenches that amplify the sound of the ride once again. Both offer good whip, and it can cause a little bit of headbanging, especially if you are not prepared for them. That is one thing I would say. Kumba is not really rough, but it can cause a little bit of headbanging, especially in these two elements, the two corkscrews, as for whatever reason, B&Ms from this time really don't tend to be that rough, other than a little bit of headbanging in these corkscrews. Rougarou is another great example where the ride itself is fine. It's really just the corkscrew that has a little bit of headbanging. Kumba is similar, although I wouldn't say the headbanging is quite as bad as Rougarou. Overall, it's a good element with more positive Gs in whip, and that goes for both corkscrews. Exiting the last corkscrew, you dive under the path once again and enter into a banked turn near the station. This gives the people in the station a great view as the train whips by. The train then dives into a tunnel, dubbed in the announcement to be Kumba's lair, and under its own brake run. The train hauls through the tunnel, and it's extremely loud, due to it enclosing one of the loudest rides in the world. The train exits the tunnel and enters its finale, a vertical spiral that has one of the last strong doses of positive Gs. This is a great element. You will be absolutely slammed into your seat. If you don't believe how strong the positive Gs are, when you ride this ride next, try and raise your legs into the air as you're going through the spiral. You likely won't be able to or will struggle greatly. It is extremely powerful. The unload side of the train also travels extremely close to the ground in this element, providing even more speed. After this element, the train flies into the main brakes, ending the roughly 1 minute and 55 second ride experience. Kumba overall is a gem that I hope gets preserved. Ride the ride in its current form while you can though. Kumba is my favorite coaster with inversions, and it's also my favorite coaster at Busch Gardens. Overall, it's one of the best rides I've ever been on. Overall, I'd say it's very similar to Raptor at Cedar Point. That's probably the ride that it reminds me most of. This is more due to its layout and ride experience, but I have to say I prefer Kumba, due to it being slightly more intense overall, as well as obviously having a better theme that's more fleshed out and more visible. The ride is often compared to Montu at Busch Gardens as well. I would say that they're pretty different rides. Kumba is more intense for the entire ride, whereas Montu has more intense individual elements, if that makes sense. I prefer Kumba, but Montu's an awesome ride as well. Kumba is just a little bit more relentless, and overall, that is how I would describe the entire ride. Kumba is relentless. It never lets up from the time that you drop off the lift to when you hit the main brakes. The only ride I've been on that I would say has a similar ride experience is Intimidator 305. I love newer B&Ms as well. I'm a big fan of B&Ms as a whole, but Kumba is just different in a way that everybody should try. The ride does run different depending on when you ride it. The absolute best time to ride is on a hot day with rain, which thankfully is fairly common in Florida. After the rain passes, but the track and wheels are still wet, the train will absolutely fly through the layout. For evidence of this, look up the Kumba POV titled "The Day Kumba Ran Wild" by Coasters and Travels. It shows the ride under these conditions. Overall, my rating is a perfect 10, and I can't wait to get back to Busch Gardens Tampa to ride Kumba once again.